Well, I'm joined by Abdullah al-Arian, who's a professor of history at Georgetown University in Qatar. Thank you for your time, sir. So, positive noises coming from both Hamas and Israel to this ceasefire proposal, which is still quite sketchy on the details. The speech itself, though, by President Biden, that seemed to be quite a significant intervention.
It was. I mean, we haven't seen this kind of high-level intervention on the part of this administration to come from the president to basically be outlining the details of what a ceasefire agreement might look like, I think was significant. At the same time, the U.S. suffers from a tremendous credibility problem as this chief partner of Israel's genocide against Palestinians and as a country that has continually denied all of the atrocities that have taken place. That's vetoed multiple UN Security Council resolutions, that has obviously led the rearmament of Israeli forces throughout the entire last 8 months. So I think there's still very much a long way to go here. But at the same time, I think it's certainly clear what a resolution would look like. And so what's been suggested here is very much the outlines of what we've always known would be necessary to see this brought to an end.
And did you get the impression at all when listening to President Biden that this proposal had been forced on the Israelis?
Well, certainly what we're seeing is that there is a lack of political will in the leadership, in the Israeli leadership, which of course is trying to prosecute a war and in fact a genocide in a way to preserve its own political fortunes going forward. And at the same time, I think there is a recognition among some segments of the Israeli political elites, particularly those in the military and intelligence kind of establishment, who see that there is no military solution here, and that in the last 8 months they've actually not achieved any of those stated goals. And in fact, that the only real meaningful solution here is to reach this agreement in a negotiated sense. And so there certainly does seem to be that recognition among some segments of the Israeli elite. And I think this is certainly what the U.S. administration is tapping into. So when Biden references that, he's really speaking about certain figures who've kind of alluded to this going forward and have actually put together many of the terms that we've seen in terms of what this agreement looks like.
We heard from our correspondent earlier that it is, of course, Shabbat today, which is why we're not hearing very much from the Israelis, but we may start hearing from them tonight and tomorrow. How do you expect them to respond?
Well, certainly we've already seen some rejection of this, right, from the prime minister to many of the most extremist fringe members of his cabinet. And at the same time, I think, depending on whether we see that there's a real political will on the American side to finally pressure Israel, again, something that hasn't been there in 8 months, and there's been a sort of historic level of complete support and basically acquiescence to anything that Israel has done so far. Whether we're seeing a real significant shift and a material shift from the U.S. perspective, I think remains to be seen. Again, we've heard a lot of words over these months coming out of Biden. We've never seen any actual action taken place. And so depending on what happens on the U.S. side, we can see potentially a response on the Israeli side. And
looking at how Hamas might respond, there were two things that stood out for me. One, that the outline didn't contain any mention of a permanent ceasefire in phase one, which is what Hamas has always been calling for. And secondly, I don't know if this was quite interesting to you. President Biden talked about Israel withdrawing from more populated areas of Gaza. What did he mean by that?
Well, again, I mean, this is what they mean when they say the devil is in the details, right? Is we don't know necessarily if there's some kind of acknowledgement on the U.S. side that Israel will remain occupying parts of Gaza even after the ceasefire is reached. And so I think this is a major sticking point, and certainly one that Palestinians have continuously rejected, that any part of Gaza should remain occupied. And in terms of whether there's a permanent ceasefire, I think the idea of a 6-week-long pause, or let's say, a temporary ceasefire, is meant to lead to negotiations toward a full ceasefire. Again, a lot of questions around what that would entail. I think there's a major contradiction here in the fact that both the U.S. and the Israeli side have said, on the one hand, that they don't want a future in Gaza in which Hamas has any kind of political role left. And at the same time, this is an agreement that would have to be reached through negotiations with Hamas. So how do you do that, right? How do you eliminate them as a political force and at the same time are reaching a negotiated solution that is agreed upon by all parties? So there's still very much a lot to work out in terms of the details and a lot of contradictions in terms of what the U.S.-Israeli side is saying.
Which is why we can see that no one in Gaza is getting excited about this. There's a lot still to come. OK, thank you for that. Abdullah al-Arian, Professor of History at Georgetown University.